Welcome to the first part of a series where I explore the works of history that have shaped our modern world. Why do a series like this? Well, for one thing, too often we are unaware that how we write history influences how we see the world. One of the things I hope to do in the following episodes is to show that our understanding of the world is indebted to these old histories. In this episode, we look at the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, though this term historian is used loosely, as we will see. Through Herodotus' writings, we see the origin of what Edward Said called Orientalism. The way that we as modern people view the Eastern world has its origins in Herodotus' writings. And although most of us may not have read these works, or maybe read them in a first-year university course and have forgotten, these works have laid the stones of our intellectual foundations, and by understanding them, we are better able to understand ourselves. This series begins not with the oldest historical works, but one that I consider to be the most important. Herodotus' The Histories. Why start with Herodotus? His 9 books of histories are not the oldest. Ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, of course, recorded their own histories, largely in the shape of chronicles and kings' lists, and can claim to be older. But Herodotus can be considered the first to create a work that we could recognize as a history. Before we begin, who was Herodotus? Like so many famous people in antiquity, we know almost nothing about the actual Herodotus. There are a few biographical details that have survived, and as is the case with these ancient sources, it is difficult to tell how much of it is accurate. But we do know that he was active during the 5th century BC. He himself claimed to come from the city of Halicarnassus and spent a considerable part of his life traveling among the Greek city-states, especially Athens, looking for patronage. His success among the Athenians explains in part the pro-Greek stance that the histories take. After all, biting the hand that feeds you was a bad career choice even in the 5th century BC. Although he does avoid doing a hatchet job on the Greeks' enemies, the Persians. There is little question that Herodotus was an extremely well-traveled person, and his histories display familiarity with the world outside of Greece that would have been difficult to do without first-hand experience. The result is, of course, a work of some sophisticated cosmopolitism, covering in detail the societies of the Greek city-states, the Egyptian kingdom, and the Persian Empire, along with lengthy discussions of the peoples and cultures outside what was considered the civilized world. The histories are made up of 9 books, although the term books here is a misnomer since during the 5th century BC, literary works would have been written on scrolls. At the core, the histories were meant to explain the origin of the conflict between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. For Herodotus, as with Homer, the origin of the animosity can be traced to Paris' abduction of Helen. We need to remember that for the ancient Greeks, and indeed right up to the Enlightenment, knowledge was not seen as belonging to separate categories, but rather it was a holistic whole. So while the wars between the Greeks and the Persians remain the central narrative of his work, Herodotus branches off into geography, ethnography, zoology, folklore, fable, and cultural studies, to use the term avant-la lettre. And this largely, I think, is what makes Herodotus' work so important. It's interesting because Herodotus is so obviously interested in his subject. This is not surprising when we remember that just like the Iliad, the histories would have started as a part of an oral culture. Though the histories today would not stand up to the rigors expected of today's historians, that was not the point. For the ancient Greeks, historia was as much about telling stories as it was about explaining past events. So even a work of myth like the Iliad fell under this definition. Storytelling was how information was passed on. It would not be until much later that Herodotus' work would be written down. What makes this book important today? Herodotus has come down to us as the father of history, though as others have noted, a more accurate moniker would be father of lies. It is true that there is much that is fantastical and outright wrong in the histories, which we'll look at a little later. But the importance rests on something I mentioned at the beginning, and that this is one of the first works that we can properly call history, where there is an attempt to explain important events through the context of cause and effect of human actions, and not just by appeals to the divine or inexorable fate. Though fate still plays an important role in Herodotus' world, even though the later Greek historian Thucydides often is seen as the first true historian, which I don't really dispute, as we'll see in a later episode, what Herodotus has done is shifted history from the realm of myth and epic poetry into something at once more pedestrian and yet more exciting as human actions take on the central narrative. Through Herodotus' histories, human agency moves to the center of our own stories. I have mentioned a few times already, as by way of comparison, Homer's Iliad. We must say at first that there are similarities between Homer and Herodotus, Both works began as oral culture, only to be written down much later, and both works open with the Trojan War. But whereas Herodotus offers up a prose account, Homer's work is firmly in the genre of epic poetry. While Herodotus gave room for human agency, the Iliad completely lacks that agency. Compare the opening lines of the Iliad with that of the Histories. Here is Homer. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus, son of Achilles, and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes the house of Hades, strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to be the delicate feasting of dogs. What god was it then set them together in bitter collision? Zeus' son and Leto's, Apollo, who in anger at the king drove the foul pestilence along the host, and the people perished. And this is how Herodotus begins. Learned Persians put the responsibility for the quarrel on the Phoenicians. These people came originally from the so-called Red Sea, and as soon as they had penetrated to the Mediterranean and settled in the country where they are today, they took to making long trading voyages. And then further, when referring to the abduction of Helen by Paris, Herodotus first refers to the Phoenician abduction of Greek women on one of their trading voyages, which the Greeks later avenged by stealing Europa, the daughter of the king of the Phoenicians, to which the Greeks added further outrages by kidnapping Medea, which in turn led to Paris kidnapping Helen. What is described here is a culture of abduction, which, as awful to us, Herodotus refers to as nothing worse than woman stealing. Basically, everyone does it, and according to Herodotus, it is stupid to make a fuss about it. What changes, and Herodotus shows some rare criticism of the Greeks, is that the kidnapping of Helen initiates a full-scale invasion to reclaim her. We can't discount the role of the supernatural in Herodotus. He lived and operated in a society and culture that accepted the presence of otherworldly powers. So while the pantheon of Greek deities do not make an appearance in the course of the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, Herodotus still makes plenty of room for the presence of oracles and prophecies. Those that followed and interpreted the oracles correctly prospered, and those that did not met horrible ends. Herodotus uses the Greek king Croesus as an example of what happens when you misinterpret the oracle. When preparing for war with the Persians, the oracle claimed that Croesus, if he pursued war, would bring down a mighty empire. Croesus took this to mean that he would have success in defeating the Persians, but instead it was the Greeks that were defeated, and the empire he brought down was his own. The Histories also stand out for one other reason. It is the first time we see an attempt at an ethnographical understanding of other cultures and societies. Although Herodotus was Greek, who wrote for a Greek audience, he displayed a sensitivity to other cultures that had not existed previously. We would call it cultural relativism today. Not until Montaigne's essay on the cannibals of Brazil do we see in literature an attempt to understand other societies on their own terms. At about the halfway point of Book 1, Herodotus presents to his reader a description of Persian culture and society, and what follows is a treatment of Persian cultural mores. The following are certain Persian customs which I can describe from personal knowledge. And what follows then is a lengthy description of Persian religion, which differs from Greek religious practices in that the Persians don't build altars. He talks about how culturally malleable the Persians are and how quickly they will adapt to other cultures they encounter or conquer. Herodotus even goes so far as to praise certain practices he finds admirable, while of course condemning those he doesn't. For the majority of Book 2, Herodotus portrays the Greek fascination for Egyptian society. The other side of the coin in Herodotus' ethnography still resonates today in less appealing forms. For Herodotus, Greek identity could only be defined by its relation to other cultures. Herodotus engages in what we would call othering, and this has affected how we in the West view Eastern cultures. Many of the negative stereotypes we have of the East, that it is exotic, that it represents a geography of dangerous eroticism, that its peoples are at heart barbarous and its political and social structures are at their core antithetical to Western norms, comes from Herodotus. Edward Said, in his book Orientalism, explains how these ideas of the East have affected Western discourse. Of course, Herodotus is not responsible alone for 2,000 years of Western attitudes, but some of those ideas have their origins in the Histories. Nowhere is this more clearly seen than in the discussion of what medieval people would come to call the monstrous races. And it is here that Herodotus' work veers into the fantastical. What gives the Histories its dynamism is the fact that Herodotus traveled to many of the locations he claimed to have visited. Along his travels, he picked up stories from the people he visited of fabulous creatures like the griffins, or the ants of India that would collect gold from sand, or of creatures with dog heads. As Herodotus ventured further from the center of the civilized world, the stories became more fantastical and more monstrous. Herodotus' writings would have a long life as they would come to influence Western attitudes towards the East. Pliny the Elder's Natural History is indebted to much of Herodotus. Pliny's Natural History was an encyclopedic work that became one of the main sources of medieval knowledge of the world outside of Europe. This can be seen in the Hereford Mappamundi, with its pictorials of Herodotus' monstrous races, all on the margins of the civilized world. Again, the process of creating an identity through the creation of a monstrous other. And of course, the culmination of Herodotus' work is seen in the publication of John Mandeville's Travels. The Travels were an account by Mandeville of his journey to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. During this pilgrimage, Mandeville encountered or heard about the monstrous races. The Travels were the bestseller of the day, running into multiple editions and were translated into the major European languages. Of course, it didn't matter that the whole thing was a fake. Herodotus' histories had primed Europeans to expect and accept the presence of the monstrous in the margins. As I mentioned at the outset, Herodotus' work has been criticized for its fantastical elements, and many of these criticisms were made even during his lifetime. Of course, we know that much of what Herodotus wrote is not true. There are no griffins or dog-headed people. So why has his work survived for so long? The answer, I think, is found in the eyewitness. Throughout his work, Herodotus claimed first-hand experience of his tales. The histories are peppered with statements of I saw, I heard, I know. For example, the following are certain Persian customs which I can describe from personal knowledge. Personal experience and knowledge are the pillars on which Herodotus rests his authority of the truth of his words. But he disarms his critics at the same time by exhibiting a healthy skepticism. When relating the origin of the Scythian nation as the result of a union of Targetas, one of Zeus' son, with the river Borythanes, Herodotus curtly states, I merely repeat this tradition and do not believe it myself. The same skepticism is apparent when he discusses the 10 islands, which are most likely the British Isles. Herodotus expresses doubt about their existence. I do not know anything of the existence of these islands called the 10 Islands. Herodotus' distancing of himself from the more fantastical claims allows him to give more weight to his truth claims of his experiences. He is able to say to his audience, I know some of these things are unbelievable, and I don't believe them either, but I'm just reporting what I heard. You can come to your own judgment. Herodotus' histories are not widely read outside of university courses, and yet they have had a major impact on the way we understand history with its emphasis on the cause and effect of human actions. Our understanding of the world finds its origins in Herodotus' work, given that it underpinned European cosmology for nearly 1,500 years, and still colors our attitudes to societies and cultures east of the Bosphorus. Herodotus' legacy remains with us still.